Hi, I'm Sally Banfield, and I'm a Friends of the Library member as well as a patron of the South Branch Library. I also, in my spare time, do quite a bit of quilting. We are going to make a project at the South Branch that will end up hanging in the South Branch and recommending books from library patrons at the South Branch. And it's going to be using a pretty simple pattern that's called a 9 patch. A 9 patch is a quilt block that is actually made with 9 pieces of fabric. It's normally put together in a regular pattern, and it's one of the simplest ones that you can make, and it's great for a beginner. You're going to be sewing it by hand, or you can also have the option, if you're a machine sewer, to sew it using a sewing machine. There are a couple of things to remember. The first one being you want to keep all of your seams consistent, your seam allowances. To help you do this, in your kit you will receive fabric that has 1/4 inch lines marked. Now this may be a little bit difficult to see, but it's actually done with a special marker that will iron off after it's been sewn. Now the problem is, if you iron it before you sew it, you lose those guidelines, but those lines are on there to start with, and you can use them throughout the sewing process. In your kit, you're going to receive 2 sets of 4.5 inch square pieces of fabric. They're both prints, and they're going to be used to make the outer edges of your 9 patch. You're also going to receive 1 solid piece of fabric. It's going to be your center block. Step 1 is to lay them out in a pattern. Now the pattern is actually going to be on directions that you receive that says fabric A, fabric B, and solid. So I'm going to use this one as my fabric A, this one as my fabric B, and obviously this one is my solid. To lay them out in a grid, I'm going to lay them out A on the corners. There's an A. There's an A. And there's an A. Then, kind of in a cross formation, I'm going to lay my B fabric. There's a B, and a B, and a B, and a B. And my solid is going to go right in the middle. Now, on your direction, it explains you're going to put together column 1, then column 2, then column 3. So as you're assembling them, you're going to sew the first 2 pieces together, then add the 3rd piece. Again, next row, first 2 pieces together, then add the 3rd piece. And then the 3rd row, first 2 pieces together, and then the 3rd piece. After you get them all assembled, then you're going to connect column 1 to column 2, then column 1 and 2 to column 3. That will complete the block. So this is what the kind of thing that it's going to look like when you get done. Again, this would be my A blocks, are the light pastel flower. The dark green pattern is my B blocks, and the center block is my solid, and this solid happens to be white. The other thing that makes this important is in the middle of the solid block, you're going to put the title of a book that you got from the public library, and write down the title and the author and sign your name. And it's your book recommendation. This is a book that you liked and you want other people to share. Then we will display those at the South Branch Library. The finished quilt will be assembled and put on display in the library, and people can check out what you think a good book is. So I'm going to go through step by step the directions. So I laid out my fabric already, and I'm going to sew each column together, and then I'm going to attach them together. And the back of the fabric has already been marked for you, and there are 2 sides to fabric. Print fabric especially has a right side and a wrong side. When you sew, you almost always sew right sides together. That way the seam is going to be towards the wrong side of the fabric. I have a few pins here, and that's something that you'll probably want to use just to hold my fabric in place. I'm going to line up my corners, and a lot of times I actually stick a pin right through that corner so I make sure it's lined up. I stuck a pin in to hold it in place, and I'm only sewing one edge. Now to hand sew, you will end up needing a needle and thread, and because none of the seams show on the outside of the quilt, you can use plain white thread. You don't have to go out and buy something special, no special colors or anything. And I have a piece of white thread, and on your directions it says what you use is what's called a double thread. So a double thread is a thread that is looped through the eye of the needle, and you bring the two threads together at the bottom end and you tie a knot. To tie a knot, you take your finger and you roll the thread around it one time, and then you roll it down using your thumb towards the end of your finger, and then gripping with your nails, you pull it to tie a knot in a thread, and that's the knot in the thread. And that's going to keep your thread together at the bottom, and you're going to have a double thread, so it's going to be a little bit stronger than a single thread would be. In order to sew your fabric, when it's hooked together, you're going to use an up and down or in and out motion. Normally I start right where my corner is, so that if I need, I have the seam open. I'm going to go down through, and I'm going to come back up through, and just a little piece away from it. That's going to keep my thread secure, and then I'm ready to start sewing. Now, to make it easier, sometimes I take my needle out and set it aside, because I don't need, my pin out. I don't need it anymore. All I need is my needle and thread. I'm going to do an in and out or up and down motion. If I go in, I want to make sure I go all the way through the fabric, and I'm going to come back up. Now you can do it a single stitch at a time, like this. There is my downstroke. I'm going to come back, and staying on the line, I'm going to come back up through the other direction. A way to make it easier or faster is to actually do what's called a rocking motion. Rocking motion is like this. You put the end in, and then you go maybe 1/8 or 1/4 inch and come up, and then you go right back down through, and then come up, and repeat that until you get maybe 3 or 4 stitches, and pull the thread through. And I just sewed about 1 inch instead of sewing just 1 stitch at a time. So you can see my needle is going in and out of the fabric. It goes all the way through the other side, and when I pull, the thread will be on both sides, and that's actually, you don't want to pull it too tight, but that's actually creating a seam. So if I turn it open, the right sides are together, and I've created the end of a seam. Once you get to the end of that seam, to the other place where you've pinned, you're going to press your fabric. Now remember earlier I said that the pin actually will iron off, so the marks will go away. And because it will iron off, you want to try to only iron the parts that you have already sewn. That way your guidelines will stay on there. I'm going to finish this real quick with some big stitches just so you can see what I mean. And here I go. I'm going to pull this all the way through. I got to the end. I'm going to tie a knot. In order to tie a knot, one of the things that you want to do is right on the corner, make a loop in and come right back out. And where you have that loop, you might be able to see it here, where that loop is, stick your needle through the loop and then pull tight, and that makes a little knot there. I would repeat that process 2 times to stabilize your thread, or to make sure it's not going to let go. I'm going to make my second little knot here. Again, I just went through lightly, and I'm going through my loop and pulling it tight. I can cut my thread off, and you can leave a little bit of a tail, maybe 1/2 inch or a little bit less. Take your other pin out, and now I have my 2 first pieces of my first column sewn, and it looks like that. I'm gonna iron it by using an iron. And remember I said I don't want to mark off the other parts of the line. So I'm gonna go to the darker fabric, and the blue seems to be a little bit darker. I'm gonna iron just along that seam line. And that's gonna make it flatten out. And if you look at what I did, you'll see I have my lines still here that I can use to guide me when I go to put the next piece on, but the line where I had been sewing has disappeared. I'm going to lay it back out so that I don't make a mistake, and I'm going to then go like this and flip this piece up, and I'm going to sew the next two pieces together. Now you're going to repeat that process 3 times to make your 3 columns. Then it's time to put the 3 columns together. If you look at the one that I have already done, this was my column 1, this was my column 2, and this was my column 3. So I sewed them together in the columns, and then I made a seam line going down the same way. And this is all my hand stitching. Now all of these hand stitches are individually knotted, so each one is pretty strong, and I can yank that pretty good because I got a couple of threads. It's not going to come apart easily, and it's going to work for our quilt. After you finish putting your quilt together, you can iron all the lines off. It won't matter. I'll take care of assembling it into our quilt. But when you get to the middle of this column, it's a good time to go ahead and write your book title on there. You want to practice on a piece of paper first, because if you practice on a piece of paper first and you make a mistake, if it doesn't fit or something, you can adjust it. Once you do that, you can either trace it onto, or if you have one of these iron off markers, you can write it with the iron off marker. Once you write it with the iron off marker and you see it works, then you can use a permanent marker, a Sharpie, a fine tip permanent marker of some sort. Works perfectly. Go over the title, especially darker, then single over the author's name, and then sign your own name. I signed mine because this was a book that I read actually during the COVID virus, called The Bookwoman of Troublesome Creek, and it was a really interesting story. So that's my recommendation. When you have your block all the way done and you've got your name on it and you've got your book title on it, take your block back and return it to the library. What's going to happen is I'm going to pick up all the blocks once they're due, and I will assemble it into a full quilt. There'll be what's called sashing in between, and your block will be part of that community quilt. Now, a couple things that I will remind you of. I said earlier you could also sew this using a sewing machine. So I have a sewing machine here, and it's going to work the same way. You again want to make sure that you have your lines lined up, pin it in place to make sure it's not going to shift, and you want to make sure that you get that perfect 1/4 inch seam. Now I'm going to move my sewing machine over here so that you can see, so there might be a little bit a break in the action. Now when you actually go to use the sewing machine, there's a couple special things that can make it a little bit easier. First of all, I have a special foot on my sewing machine that's a quilting foot because it gives me my 1/4 inch allowance at all times, which makes it really nice. I'm going to start sewing where my corner is, and I always like to check and make sure that I have my right position. My material actually lines up with my 1/4 inch seam, but I'm going to end up sewing exactly where this marked line is. When I begin sewing, I'm sewing with a straight stitch. On most quilts, you try to sew with a stitch that is only 2 millimeters long, and that way it's a little bit sturdier. And when I sew, I actually have a fix button on my sewing machine that knots it at the beginning. Once it fixes it, I go ahead and I sew, trying to keep it as straight as possible. And when I get to the end, my sewing machine again has a few special features. I can actually fix my thread again so the thread won't pull out. It takes 3 stitches in place, and then I have a thread cutter that's going to cut my thread. Now if you don't have those features, can you still sew? Yep, and this is what it looks like. I have a finished seam. I'm going to take my extra pin out, and now that actually finishes my whole first column. And I would sew it again. I'm going to iron it towards the darker side, and my column would be ready. From the front, you can't tell a whole lot of difference in the stitching, whether it's machine stitched or whether it's hand stitched. If you are a machine stitcher, make your quilt block just the same. If you are a hand stitcher, remember, it's a good thing to try. If you can do this, by the way, you can also sew on a button, hem a pair of pants, or other things like that, so it might be a handy skill to know. If you do end up liking quilting and you try one block and you want to do a little bit more, there are lots of materials that you can get that can make it a little bit more fun and a little bit interesting. I have found at the library and in other locations several books that tell you how to make quilts, how to take care of quilts, how to design your own quilts, and I'll let you just see a few of those books here, and that way you can get an idea. Quilts have been around for centuries. American quilting has a long history, and there are wonderful displays throughout the country. There's a National Quilt Museum in Paducah, Kentucky. There are quilts on display at many of the art museums and at the Smithsonian that you can go and visit. They are historical in nature, and some of them are a little bit political in nature. They also are artistic. There are competitions for all different types of quilting throughout the world and throughout the country, and it's just a neat hobby. And again, you're going to be contributing to 2 things. 1, the South Branch quilt, and 2, making book recommendations for other South Branch patrons so they can find good books to read when they come to the library. I hope you enjoy the program, and remember, you need to pick up your kit from the library at the South Branch, and there are a limited number of kits available, and all you will need to supply: scissors, thread, and a needle, or if you have a sewing machine, you can do that as well. Happy quilting!